I remember the night that my first child was born. I have 3 daughters, and the night that my oldest daughter was born, I was 12 days overdue. 12 days is a long time, and every minute of it feels like you are just stretching and stretching and stretching both the time and yourself. If you guys have ever felt that waiting, that is how I felt. We had some friends come over at night to distract us by playing cards and keeping my mind off of everything, um, off of the fact that this baby wasn't coming. And they walked out the door late at night, and just a few minutes later, the contractions started. And so I thought, yay, it worked. We're going to have this baby tonight. And yet, that is also not what happened. Mark took me to the hospital around midnight, and there were 12 hours of labor. I pushed for 2 hours, and that didn't work either. An epidural needle nicked a nerve in my back and caused some other problems. I ended up with an emergency C-section. Um, Mark had had surgery on his ankle 2 weeks before the baby came, and he was still on crutches. And so, even as they are wheeling me into the emergency C section operating room, they're having to bring a wheelchair for him so that he won't fall over in the operating room. And his foot was in pain from standing all night next to me. And then there was the pushing and the tugging of the C-section, which has got to be one of the weirdest sensations I've ever felt in my entire life. And then in the midst of all of these things that are happening, of all these sights and sounds and feelings, a baby was there. She was the most perfect little girl I have ever seen. In my memory, I see her arrival from somewhere below the operating divider, and she's being put into my arms, and everything sort of focuses on her for just this moment. And then they take her away, and they're measuring her, and they're checking her out, and they're sewing me up, and they're doing all the things they've got to do. And my body is like, what is just happening? And then everything else goes back to a blur. There was something about my body being sewn back together, and some noise about bleeding too much, and then me being wheeled into recovery, completely confused and tired and unable to move most of my body because of the problem with epidural. And I would have to say that my daughter's birth did not go how I expected. It did not go how I expected. We had taken classes because this was our first child. We had taken classes to help us know how everything was going to go. And we had written a birth plan, and we were going to tell our doctor how things were going to go, as if you can do that. But neither the things that we learned in the class nor the plan that we so carefully prepared, none of that happened the way that we wanted to. Not the way that it was supposed to, not the way that it should have gone. But some of you have a story like mine, moms and dads. Some of you are now panicked because you don't have children yet. And my story is starting to freak you out just a little bit. Some of you have a much gentler birth story that you could tell that went exactly the way that you planned it. And some of you don't have children, and you would just like to have a story that ended with a baby. And I honor that. Some of you don't have children, don't expect to have children, and you're glad that you don't have a story like mine. Regardless of whether or not you have children, we all have a story of part of our lives that didn't go the way that we expected. And if you're listening to this in 2020 or in 2021, you understand that things sometimes don't go the way that we have expected them to go. We had planned to do things a certain way, or we had an expectation of how they would go. And the way that it turned out was so much different that it was unrecognizable. And today I want to tell you that that is the way that the story of Mary, the mother of Jesus, goes. When we first meet Mary in the Bible, she is a young, unmarried woman. She is living in a small town with a reputation for being boring and mediocre at best. My best analogy for being from Nazareth is being from Belen, New Mexico. Have any of you guys ever been to Belen? It's not a bad town. It's just a really quiet kind of place where people work hard and they live their lives quietly, and nothing really amazing and nothing really spectacular ever happens in Belen. It's just Belen. And nor does anything monumental happen in Nazareth. Mary realistically expects that she will have a simple life and that it will be very straightforward, that she will get married, that she will have children, that she will run a household, that she will live a simple, quiet life. And that is not an unreasonable expectation for Mary growing up there. But then God shows up, and suddenly her expectations change drastically. In the first chapter of Luke, we see that Mary is visited by an angel who tells her that she's going to have a baby in the strangest way possible. I mean, now this is the part of Mary's story that we are probably very familiar with, one that we hear over and over and over again. Without there being a man involved, she will become pregnant with a child, and this child will be named Jesus. The child will be called God's son, and he will reign as king of Israel. Now, today I don't want to focus on this part of Mary's story very much because I want to spend some time on her latter parts of her story, but I need to spend a few minutes here in the familiar story of the virgin birth because this is where Mary's expectations begin. Her child, this child will be called God's son, and he will reign as king of Israel. This is what the angels tell Mary. Those are some high expectations. This child hasn't even been conceived yet, and Mary already knows that he will be great. He will be influential, both in the religious community and in the political world. He will be important. Her son. She knows that this means that her child will be the long-awaited rescuer that the nation of Israel is expecting. And those are some seriously high expectations. When the child is just a few days old, Mary and her new husband Joseph take the child, as is the custom, to the temple in Jerusalem, present him in the proper religious and legal way. In a sense, this is sort of like the moment that Jesus legally becomes Joseph's son. It's like the signing of the birth certificate in our world. When they have accomplished this, they're prepared to leave Jerusalem. But on the way out of the temple, they meet two prophets, Simeon and Anna. Now, they both stop to speak over the baby. Simeon says something that Mary takes note of. In Luke 2, verses 34 and 35, it says, "And Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, Behold, this child is appointed for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign that is opposed, and a sword will pierce through your own soul also, so that thoughts from many hearts may be revealed." Now, Mary already has heard that her son will be great in Israel. First from the angel, and now from this prophet. And what Simeon says adds to what Mary is going to be experiencing herself. What Simeon adds is that Mary's soul will be pierced by this child. His words add to the expectations that she has for this child and for his influence, but in a strange and strangely personal and unknown way. Now, we find out something about Mary early in her story, and that is that she is curious. Mary is curious. She is watchful and she thinks about things. Twice in her story, we see written that she treasures things up in her heart. Curiosity about what is happening, about what is being said, about who Jesus is and who he will become. Mary gathers interesting events and she stores them in her mind and in her heart. By the time that Jesus is a young adult, Mary is aware that he has power, at least in a spiritual way. We don't know how she knows, but she doesn't hesitate to ask him to use this power to help her. When her friends have a party to celebrate their wedding in Cana, she knows that Jesus can miraculously provide the wine for the party. She knows that she can count on him when he comes to her aid to use his power to benefit her friends. She tells Jesus when they run out of party supplies, and even though he questions why she's involving him, she knows that he will solve the problem. She tells the servants to pay attention to whatever he tells them to do. And then she waits. When he does the miracle, her expectations are met. I can imagine how pleased and joyful and proud Mary must have been when Jesus turned the water to wine at the wedding in Cana. His first miracle, because she knew that he could and also that he would. His power is now revealed to everyone there. But Jesus will not always meet Mary's expectations. He won't. In fact, she will find that God does not have to meet our expectations. He has a plan, and he is going to move forward that plan whether our expectations are aligned with his purposes or not. As Jesus moves into his public ministry after that first miracle at Cana, he begins to move away from Mary's expectations. He creates a controversy with the religious leaders of his day, and he begins to teach some strange ideas, and his family begins to worry that he might be a little crazy. Let's read in Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 38. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the teaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. When the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places seeking rest, but finds none. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house empty, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits, more evil than itself, and they enter and they dwell there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. So also it will be with this evil generation. While he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside, asking to speak with him. But he replied to the man who told him, "Who is my mother? And who are my brothers?" Stretching out his hand to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." Okay. What just happened? Jesus first picks a fight with these religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees. He calls them an evil and adulterous generation. He talks about how well-known people in history who were doing evil until a prophet came and they changed their ways. How he says that the religious leaders of this day and age are not doing as well as those people. After he has the religious leaders good and mad, then he starts talking about evil spirits, and everyone is confused about what he's trying to say. Even his own family is starting to think that he has lost it. They go to collect him. They go to collect him, to take him away quietly so that he can't make this situation worse for himself. They send someone in to get him, assuming, expecting that he will come when he is called by his mother. But he doesn't. He says something that makes it clear that he does not intend to change his ways, his words, his tone, his teaching, or his plan in order to accommodate his family's expectations of him. He disowns them because they are not about what God is about in that moment. He aligns himself with those who are on mission with him instead of with his family. After this, his family sort of disappears from the story for a while. You can kind of understand why. You can imagine the heartbreak that Mary has. Her oldest son has disowned the family. Put that into today's context. He doesn't respond to her texts. He doesn't return her phone calls. He doesn't come home for Christmas. You guys, that's funny because Christmas is his birthday, right? Okay, I'm laughing at my own jokes. Jesus doesn't come home for Christmas. Jesus has moved away, moved his focus from fulfilling his mother's expectations to fulfilling his heavenly Father's expectations. His Father's plan must now come first, and Jesus won't look back. At some point, Mary must have come to terms with this. She's been treasuring things up in her heart and pondering them since the beginning. We don't know where her faith turns the corner. From believing that Jesus is going to be the perfect child to believing that he is here on God's mission. We don't know where her faith moves from seeing Jesus' power as a personal blessing to her to seeing Jesus' power as God's mission to save the world. We don't know when. And maybe that realignment of her faith from being self-focused, from being based on Jesus' fulfilling of her expectations, maybe that adjustment comes bit by bit over the next few months. Because we don't know when or really how, but she must have pondered it long enough that she comes to understand that Jesus is not going to fulfill all of her expectations. He's going to fulfill his purpose from God. And at some point along this path, Mary's faith begins. We know that Mary eventually goes back to Jesus. This time, not as a mother trying to get her son to follow her, but rather as a believer following her Savior. As the religious leaders have arrested Jesus, as the legal authorities have condemned him to death, as soldiers are crucifying him and casting lots for his clothing, we see Mary at the foot of the cross. She is no longer demanding him to fulfill her expectations. She is no longer embarrassed of his words or his actions. She is there at the cross identifying herself with him. In John 19:25, John writes, "But standing by the foot of the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, 'Woman, behold your son.' And then he said to the disciple, 'Behold your mother.' And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home." Now, at the end of his life, Mary has adjusted her expectations to know that this is God's plan for her son. This difficult path that he is on is not something that she can change. Now Jesus retakes the role of oldest son. He provides for the care of his mother after his death. She identifies herself with him, and he identifies himself with her once again. At the beginning of the church, we see in Acts chapter 1 that Mary is numbered with the believers who are meeting together, the first church. And so, what do we learn from Mary? I learned from looking closely at Mary's life that God won't meet all of my expectations. Some of my expectations don't fit him, and he doesn't change to fit mine. I adjust my expectations to him. And this is hard for me because I am a goal oriented type of person with high expectations, not only of myself, but also of God. There are good things that I want to happen, just like Mary did. And when I accept that God has his own plans and that he is going to make everything happen so that his goals are accomplished, and that might or might not include my goals, then I align myself to him. We align ourselves to him when we recognize that he won't meet all our expectations. We have to come through a long process, like Mary did, to trust that he is good, even when it doesn't look like what we expected. So, how can we do that? We can do that by staying curious. Staying curious about the things you see God doing around you. As you stay curious and you treasure these things up, you will start to notice that God is at work in the lives of people around you. You may not know exactly what these things might mean right when they happen, so treasure them up in your heart like Mary did. Keep pondering them and thinking about what God is doing. And if you're forgetful like me, then you might want to write them down. Keep them, treasure them, think about them. Keep treasuring those things up in your heart so that you will see what God is doing. And then when you adjust your expectations to his, you join him in the ways that you see him working. Stay curious. Treasure those things up. Adjust your expectations to his and follow him.